Okay. Um, okay, so we're going to record this event, as you just heard, in case you didn't hear that announcement. Um, okay, so it's a good habit for everyone to keep themselves muted unless they want to ask questions, which is during our Q&A session, which we'll provide at the end. Um, if you can turn off your videos, that's really great. It prevents, people getting distracted, especially if you're moving around. Um, we will have a QA session at the end. If there's a couple of different ways you can ask questions. If you have your video on, you can wave your hand the old-fashioned way. That's always a good approach. Or else you can, there's a reaction button at the lower part of the screen, and you can raise your hand electronically. And finally, if you have any questions, you can add it into the chat feature, and Ellen will keep track of those and pose questions towards the end of the event. Okay, and we have started our recording. So I'm going to do a land acknowledgement. So Toronto Field Naturalists wishes to acknowledge this land through which we walk. For thousands of years, the land has been shared by the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe. Toronto is situated on the lands within the Toronto Purchase, Treaty 13, the traditional and treaty lands of the Mississauga and the Credit First Nations. This territory is also part of the Dish of One Spoon Wampum, a convention agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Wendat peoples, and allied nations to peaceably share the land and all of its resources. Today, the land is home to people of numerous nations. We are all grateful to have the opportunity to continue to care for and share the beauty of this land. Thank you so much for the whole lecture committee for organizing the lecture season this spring, including today's lecture on Toronto's innovative grazing projects using goats. Okay, so a little while ago, my son, who loves to visit the brickworks, he's 18 years old, so he's not exactly a young one, but he loves to go there, and he came back very excited one day, and he was like, Dad, I saw a whole bunch of goats at the brickworks. What's going on? So we went over the next day, did a little bit of exploring. We saw that a section was roped off where the goats had been munching away, removing invasive species. So naturally, we sort of wondered about how do the goats know what is invasive and what's not? Now I get to host an event and truly witness the power of the goats. Okay. All right. Before I start, I want to welcome anybody joining us today. This event is shared on several social media channels aside from the TFN website. Please share in the chat how you heard about us. We hope you'll come again and join it, and we hope you'll join us as members of Toronto Field Naturalists. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Cheryl Post, Natural Environmental Specialist in the City of Toronto. Cheryl Post, a passionate natural environmental specialist within the City of Toronto Urban Forestry team. For over 10 years, Cheryl has been leading the way on projects that bring nature and the city to life in harmony. Think wetlands, boardwalks, and eco-friendly trails. Most recently, she launched Toronto's groundbreaking Prescribed Grazing Project, introducing goats as natural caretakers of our urban green space, the first initiative of its kind in Ontario. Okay, so Cheryl, do you want to take it away?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm Cheryl Post. I'm a natural environment specialist with City of Toronto's Urban Forestry, and I am the project creator and lead project manager for the Prescribed Grazing Project, which I'm very delighted to be talking about with you today. And I do really want to thank all of you for coming and TFN for having me. TFN's been a great partner on this project, and so it's very gratifying to have a chance to speak about this here today. So I'm going to share my screen. And if somebody could let me know if you see everything properly, that would be great.
See your notes right now.
Okay, well, let's change that.
Perfect.
Hold on. gonna get out of here. Apologies, this was all just fine a minute ago.
And we all love computers.
Oh, don't we? Let's do this again. And hold on for me.
That looks good.
All good?
Yep,
Awesome.
perfect.
Fantastic. All right, we've gotten there. So I'm going to start before I go into Toronto's prescribed grazing project specifically. I really want to take a step back first and discuss what prescribed grazing is and why it can be a useful tool. So, prescribed grazing is the process of using a variety of different types of livestock, sort of like goats and sheep are the main ones, but to achieve specific land management goals in ecosystems that are well adapted to grazing, like meadows and prairies. So, the overarching concept is to mimic the evolutionary adaptation of large herds that grazed in these ecosystems. Historically, large herds of grazing animals helped shape prairie and meadow ecosystems as they evolved together. So, for example, prairie ecosystems evolved over 30 million years alongside over 20 large grazing species. So, think mastodons, mammoths, antelope, deer, and even camels, with herds of bison being the largest since the last ice age. And these large historical herds exerted pressures on the landscape and influenced the species that grew and the soil ecology. So they brought nutrients to the soil through their wastes, they reduced woody growth, they enhanced seed germination as their hooves disturbed the surface, and all of this really impacted the type of ecosystems that evolved along with them. So now in modern times, land managers and researchers are beginning to use herds of domesticated livestock like goats to essentially mimic the actions of those ancient herds and to preserve ecosystem health and diversity. So that said, I do want to caveat that although I mainly focus on the use of prescribed grazing in meadow management, since that's the focus of my project, it's important to note that prescribed grazing can also be used in other types of land management depending on various different goals and pressures. So think, for example, the use of grazers in managing road or rail right-of-ways, or on solar farms, or in forest understories. It's all valid. It just depends on your focus of your project and your goals. And because ours is very specifically looking at meadow management, that's going to be the goal of this presentation. So prescribed grazing has been shown to have a number of potential management benefits, like helping to control invasive, non-native, or incompatible plant species. So we do like to differentiate here since there are subtle differences between these designations. So poison ivy, for example, is a native plant, but can be locally incompatible with land use if it's encroaching on areas that come into contact with park users. And grazing can help reduce or eliminate woody vegetation encroachment, which I'll go into in more detail in a minute. It can improve native species regeneration and diversity over time, improve soil characteristics and nutrients, and in some cases, it's also been used to reduce fire hazards. Now, I want to narrow it in a bit as to why this can be beneficial as a management tool within an urban context specifically. So first, it's important to recognize that, as I'm sure you all know, being part of TFN, that maintaining habitat diversity, just having many different types of healthy habitats, is really an important goal, particularly in urban areas under increased pressure. So different habitat types like forests and meadows and wetlands, they all offer specific benefits and they host different plants and animals. So as habitat diversity increases in an urban area, species diversity can also improve and the opposite. That said, healthy habitat diversity in urban areas often needs to be sustained through ongoing, sometimes intensive management activities. So in Toronto, for example, some areas of our natural parkland are purposefully maintained as meadow habitat, which is often somewhat rare or underrepresented in urban areas. So we often have, gray space and we have forested space, or we have mown grass sports fields are the sort of variety of ecosystem space. But meadows often are underrepresented within urban areas. But we can only maintain those meadow areas, those meadow habitats through ongoing management, or we could lose that diversity. So meadows specifically need to be actively managed and maintained to stay viable, since they're generally considered what's called a subsuccessional habitat type, which means that if they're left alone, they would eventually become forests over time as trees and shrubs begin to move into the area and take root here. Typically in Toronto, meadow habitat that's unmanaged would eventually progress to forest habitat over time as woody species colonize the area, or they might be overtaken with invasive species like dog strangling vine or buckthorn. And both situations would end up in a net loss of species and habitat diversity. So this again is why a management tool like grazing that can directly help reduce woody and invasive encroachment can be such a good fit here. Now, it's important to note that integrative management is really the name of the game in managing complex urban ecosystems, since it's pretty rare that only one management technique or tool can do the whole job all on its own. So there are so many techniques and tools that are valuable pieces of the land management puzzle, including mowing, mechanical methods like digging or pulling, chemical treatments, and even prescribed burning, all of which we use in Toronto. And each management practice has its own most effective niche and benefits and challenges. So what's great though is that prescribed grazing can be well integrated with those best management practices. So the Prescribed Grazing Project really looks to introduce grazing as a new environmentally friendly tool in our meadow management toolbox, so to speak. And it's also a really exciting opportunity to showcase the city's commitment to innovative ecosystem management on an integrative basis. So as we look at, um, sorry, my screen has frozen here. There we go. So as we look to incorporate grazing into our management practices, we're particularly interested in the unique benefits it can specifically offer compared to, say, only mowing or only chemical control, some of which are really quite compelling, including reduced carbon emissions, noise pollution, and reliance on mechanical equipment, reduced impacts to ground nesting, burrowing, or slow moving animal species that we might find challenge with mowing alone, the possible favored regrowth of native species and improved species diversity, the possible reduction in the amount of chemical herbicide required to control invasive and woody plants over time, possible reduced labor associated with specialized manual control methods like cutting, pulling, digging, or spading. Anyone who's ever volunteered on a stewardship team knows how much work those manual methods can take. Scarification of the soil and organic waste inputs can also help germination rates and soil quality, which is absolutely not accomplished in any of the other methods. And last but really far from least, grazing is a really compelling mechanism for public education and engagement around the importance of ecosystem management. So it's a really valuable opportunity to promote the efforts of land managers, and it's really visible and engaging to the broader public. All right, so now that I've hopefully sold you on why prescribed grazing, I'll move on now to more of the specifics of our pilot project. So last June 2024, City of Toronto Urban Forestry brought about 65 goats to graze the meadow at Don Valley Brickworks Park. And after years of project planning, we were really proud to be the first municipality in Ontario to pilot comprehensive urban goat grazing for ecosystem management. And I really hope the project demonstrates Toronto's commitment to the protection and enhancement of our urban ecosystems, but also to innovation and new ideas And I will say it's been very nice since the pilot to see that other municipalities and land managers have also shown an interest since learning of our project and seem to be moving forward with projects of their own. So for context, as I'm sure almost all of you know, Don Valley Brickworks Park is a very popular and very busy natural environment park located in the heart of the Don River watershed, which is one of Canada's most urbanized watersheds. The park is one of Toronto's flagship natural environment restoration projects. So it was restored from a former quarry to really showcase not only restoration, but also habitat diversity, that habitat diversity that I was speaking of earlier. So it has forest, meadow, wetland areas that each have their own extensive native plant communities. So my focus for this grazing project was on the main meadow node, right in the central bowl of the park, which you can see in the photo. Um, and the grazing site was approximately 3,000 square meters, which is about half of the total central meadow. And so in terms of the duration and stocking rates, our pilot ran for about 2.5 days total with over 65 goats. It was 2 days for the public, and there was a half day for getting the goats settled, and also for some of our stewardship teams to come and have a learning opportunity. So while this might seem like a short time and a large number of goats, that was chosen for a reason. So again, I wanted to mimic those evolutionary large herd pressures that I mentioned earlier as much as possible. So I wanted to go with a high stocking rate to better impact the site. And I also needed to reduce timelines, logistics, resources, and all of that needed for the project. So keeping the stocking rate high, fast, and intense allowed us for maximum efficiency while also really mimicking those evolutionary large herd pressures. Our pilot centered around a number of specific management goals, including addressing that woody encroachment that I mentioned earlier. We had a variety of woody species encroaching on the site, mostly buckthorn, but also cottonwoods and willows. Addressing herbaceous, non-native, invasive, and non-compatible plant species. Increasing native species regeneration and diversity over time. And a bit of a unique one was finding new ways to manage a site with very high public pressures and very specific use patterns. So having as many visitors as we do can really limit our management opportunities in certain parks. So, for example, I had to make the choice to stop mowing management here in this portion of meadow because as soon as I did, people would mistake the area for just a typical mown grass field, which would result in picnicking and sports play and significant off-leash dog activity, which was causing a lot of damage and trampling. So I would say about 10 years ago, we had to stop mowing and we're looking for new and unique tools that could fit the site. So lastly, prescribed grazing represented a really valuable chance for public engagement and education, which was really at the forefront of project planning, along with a strong commitment to animal welfare and public safety. So the idea here was not only do we need a tool that addresses meadow management and meadow health and the actual, hard science of ecological management, but also how would it fit in with a very busy and popular public park, and not only a way that people would accept and enjoy, but in a way that would engage and educate them as to why this meadow is important habitat and it's not just another dog off leash area or a place to throw a football around. So this is a good opportunity for me to take a second and get into some of the more complex planning choices that had to be made and to mention our contracted partners, Goats in the City. As part of the very extensive planning and development phase, finding where I could actually get our goats and eco shepherd from was probably one of the most critical steps. And it took me many years to find someone who could satisfy the complex requirements of this site and project. So while grazing might appear to just be plunking a herd of goats on a site. I can assure you that the planning capacity, outreach, and logistics needed to pull off something like this in a highly urbanized park meant that we really needed to choose and plan very carefully. So, Goats in the City are a grazing company based north of Toronto and are specifically dedicated to using their eco herd of goats solely for urban and suburban prescribed grazing. They have a specific interest in ecosystem management and sustainability. So the goats in the city eco herd are largely chosen and bred for maximum effectiveness, specifically at prescribed grazing, using a large base breed it's called the Kiko breed as their main breeding line to maximize the amount of vegetation they can consume. So the Kiko is a large breed of goat. And goats generally eat about 3 to 4% of their body weight every day. So, with their goats at an average weight of about 160 pounds and consuming about 7 pounds of vegetation daily, their herd fit well with our size and timing of our project. And the size of their goats also allows them to tackle taller plants and woody vegetation like buckthorn up to 5 feet off the ground, which obviously, when woody management was very much at the heart of our management goals, that was very important to us that we had large enough goats that could tackle woody encroachment. So, as I mentioned before, the question of animal welfare was really critical to our planning choices. So, first and foremost, the goats in the city eco herd are only used for prescribed grazing and they aren't ever sold or used for food um, or any other byproducts. The goats will live out their full lives at the farm, other than their various grazing locations. They don't provide meat, milk, fibers, or any other consumables. And some of the goats are even rescues. And then for the grazing work itself, grazing in a herd is completely natural behavior for the goats. So it's not stressful for them. It's what they'd be doing at home, and they're kept in their family groups, including babies with their mothers. We use a double fencing system and make sure they're safe from both predators and from the public, as well as the public from the goats, and make sure that they had free access to water, sun, and rain shelter at all times. When they're on site, they also have 24-hour in-person care and supervision, including overnight, GPS herd tracking, vets on call for the full project. City of Toronto enforcement officers were also on call or on site to help support us, especially to help make sure that any visitors coming to see the goats had their dogs on leash at all times. Really, overall, though, you could sort of just see how comfortable the goats were. I had more than one person remark on how calm and pastoral the whole scene felt. They were at work, sure, but really they were just going about their normal and natural business of eating with their herd. So to take a quick closer look at that fencing, we had secured double perimeter fencing around the project site to keep the goats safe from predators and the public safe from the goats. And the exterior fence was a 6 foot tall metal mesh fence that's usually known as fast fence or construction fence. And then for the interior fence, goats in the city use a really mild, low voltage mesh fence. That's the white fence you can see in the photos. That helps the goats visually understand the specific areas that they're meant to stick to. And by low voltage, I literally mean it's like getting flicked by a rubber band lightly. I've touched it just to make sure that it's anything serious. It's really just that the goats have grown up with that fence since they were babies, and they have it at every site they work at and at home. So they understand that as their own recognized barrier. And the goats are really curious. All goats are curious by nature. So including a new fence system for them would likely not have turned out the way that we wanted. So you need something that's very familiar and that they just understand as their barrier. And this fence is also a deterrent to coyotes, which are present on the site. But it was not switched on during the day when the public are present. As I said, it's more of a visual barrier for the goats. We also used that white interior fence as an additional division fence to divide the grazing area again into two separate halves. So the goats were in the first half of the grazing site the first day, and then were moved to the second area on the second day. And so functionally, that works to intensify stalking rates. Again, as we discussed, that high stocking rate is actually what we're looking for. And it also helps keep the goats focused on grazing as opposed to exploring or patrolling larger areas. So as I say, goats are very curious, and if you give them a great big area, they'll spend a lot of their time just kind of poking around trying to see what's going on instead of actually eating. So I'm going to put up some before, during, and after drone footage of the site so that you can get a better idea of all these things I've been talking about. So let me get this played. So, okay, we're swooping in on our grazing site in advance of the fencing installation and goat arrival. You can see some of that woody encroachment. It's a little difficult to see all of the small sprouts throughout. Now, in the during shots, you can see that the 3,000 meters squared that we set aside for grazing is about half of the total core meadow area. The area was then, as I mentioned, divided again in half with that division fence, with the goats grazing one half each day. You can also see the variety of habitat types throughout the park, with the wetlands bordering the meadow and the forest beyond that. Overall, you can see just how effective the herd was at grazing down the entire area delineated for them, with both herbaceous and woody species being targeted. And we can have another shift in perspective here. Hold on. With our drone footage from directly overhead. So you can really clearly see that the goats worked in two distinct halves, as well as their sun and rain shelters and the mobile trailer for the 24-hour supervision. I'll note that those larger woody specimens, the larger woody trees that you can still see standing post-grazing. So one is a large cottonwood that we're actually allowing to stay for habitat value. It might eventually be a target for the beaver family we have in the park, but for the time being, we're allowing that larger tree to stay. And the idea with this first graze is that since we've had a number of years without woody management, since we've stopped mowing, there are some woody plants too large for the goats to tackle at this stage. So those large plants receive follow-up treatment by forestry staff, although there didn't prove to be too many left. But the idea is that as grazing continues to occur, small resprouts of woody invasives will be managed by the goats moving forward, which should make that extra step of overly large items less necessary over time, if at all. So obviously from the talk of visitors and fencing and public interest, and even from some of the photos and drone images you're seeing, it's obvious that not only did we have a need for outreach and engagement during this process or this project, but it was also really one of our most important goals. So the project was such a great opportunity to teach the public about the importance of ecosystem management and about Toronto's dedication to managing the health of our natural spaces. We really wanted to capitalize on that. It was just such a good outreach opportunity. I did want to make a particular note here as well that it was really important to me in project planning that while the goats are interesting and cute and fun, I didn't just want the messaging of this project to be come down and look at the goats or anything like a goat attraction. Messaging is really deliberately targeted around our management objectives and the idea that the goats are an exciting new tool to help us with that management and that they're really doing an important job for us, as cute as they were. So, in addition to post-event activities and opportunities like this one and various different talks that I've been able to do to help spread the word on the project, we had a lot of engagement opportunities during the event itself. So over 1,300 park visitors took part in staff-led talks, with others on top of that being able to learn more informally from educational signage that was installed around the site and just chatting with myself and our Eco Shepherd Ian throughout the event, or online from our website and social media posts. In terms of media, this project was able to generate some pretty impressive interest with over 143 specific mentions from local and national media outlets during the event, and close to 140 million online impressions, with both of those metrics have only grown since the event itself. But what was really great, I think, that really stood out to everybody involved was that of all of those mentions, 100% were considered positive sentiment, including public interaction in the field, which I think anyone involved in municipal land management activities or any kind of public facing uh, management choices that are being made on public land can appreciate that kind of 100% positive sentiment. It was really lovely to see how engaged and happy people were to see this project moving forward. So just to take a short second here to show you some of the signage types that we had up on site and some of the breadth of the knowledge base we were trying to share with people. Um, these signs were particularly helpful for those visitors whose first comment when they got on site was, "Where are the goats? I don't want to talk to you. I don't want a tour. I just want to go see the goats." So having these signs up around the site really gave people a chance to that weren't interested in more formal education talks, a chance to still learn about what we were doing and why. So we had signs with information about the project as a whole, meadow management and the history of the park. We had signs about the goats themselves, including some particular cameos from, of some charismatic individuals. Some signs dedicated to stressing the importance of proper etiquette around the goats, including keeping dogs off leash, or on leash, I'm sorry, etc. So a lot of different opportunities to talk about the breadth of different important elements with the project. So before I get into our initial vegetation observations, you are likely curious how we're monitoring this project for success. And given TFN's deep involvement in that critical step, I'm sure many of you already know what I'm about to talk about. But Toronto is really committed to monitoring on this project so that we can understand how grazing influences the meadow over time. And we're doing that in two key ways. The first and definitely the most extensive is with Toronto Field Naturalists. And we've been really fortunate to have TFN as a longtime collaborator on a wide range of projects and programs. And I was really excited to bring your great team on board for the Prescribed Grazing Project. So, as a background, City of Toronto Forestry staff, myself included, have been working with TFN for a number of years to develop volunteer monitoring protocols to collect and study species inventories in our natural environment sites. So the protocol was first used successfully for a number of years at Cottonwood Flats, which is a nearby site that's also in the Don Valley. You could probably walk there from the brickworks in 10 or 15 minutes. So in advance of the grazing pilot, I asked TFN if they would be interested in expanding and tailoring that same protocol to the meadow at Don Valley Brickworks Park. So the goal of the partnership is for TFN volunteers to undertake a inventory of flora biodiversity at the site prior to and following and ongoing after the introduction of the goat grazing. So the protocol assesses trends in vegetation over time and will generally examine whether the introduction of grazers has a net positive impact on the meadow and the vegetation community as we roll this out over time. So TFN's been monitoring the majority of the full central node in the meadow since 2023, which you'll remember we grazed half of in 2024, which was then separately monitored pre and post grazing activities. And the site will continue to be monitored as we move forward in future years, and I'll get into some of our preliminary observations in a second. Lastly, the city has also contracted for drone imagery, some of which you saw, though that was a little bit more promotional imagery. But we've got drone imagery and set up photo monitoring plots throughout the site, which are regularly photographed to see changes in the plant community and landscape over time. So reviewing the photos as we go will help to document and compare any changes in response to grazing and other management techniques. Um, at first glance, sometimes post-management photos can look a little bit stark. So sometimes people are like, oh, it looked better on the left than on the right. But the learned eye can see that heavily defoliated buckthorn over there on the right and some intact common milkweed. So showing some likely potential positive progress in that, as well as how the goats were able to cover this entire site. So with all of that discussed, what were some of our main initial observations, both in the field and from the TFN report? So one of the questions I get the most is, was the pilot a success? And the answer is really a resounding yes, but we do have some important nuance. So at this early stage, it's really important to remember that some observations are more immediately obvious on a shorter timescale. So like the impact on woody encroachment and those really fantastic outreach and engagement metrics. But other things will likely take time to see, like native and invasive species regeneration over time. We just can't see that in one season. But with that caveat, though, the project could definitely be called a success based on our initial observations. Overall, the goats successfully completed their grazing of the whole 3,000 square meters of meadow that was set out for them. And they preferentially targeted woody species like buckthorn and willow and Manitoba maple. They also targeted a variety of other species throughout. So one particular striking observation was just how effective, though, the goats were at targeting buckthorn. So they loved it. Buckthorn was a number one. So goats, the way that this works is that goats will eat just about anything, but they'll eat various species within their order of preference. So they will eat, but they'll eat their favorite things first and then work their way down the menu, much like probably a lot of people do. And buckthorn was really absolutely their number one target. They were barely off the trailer before they were swarming and fighting over the first buckthorn they saw. And you can see in this video on the right that even after they ate the leaves and twigs, which again, tastiest first, they would move on to eat and rub the bark. So, which effectively girdled any buckthorn that was too large to eat all the way down to the ground. So you can see here in that video how he's rubbing on that bark and how the bark is completely gone, which completely girdles the plant. On the flip side, though, while buckthorn, willow, and poison ivy appeared to be their favorite target species, the common milkweed, which is an important native species on site, was found to be a less palatable plant for the goats, and we were able to keep it largely intact, which we expect could possibly, if not probably, improve its regeneration in future as competition was reduced around it. Now, that's not to say that goats won't eat common milkweed. Goats will eat, as I say, just about anything given enough time. But as I mentioned, goats will eat in their order of preference, and the milkweed was really close to the bottom of the menu. So, with that knowledge in hand and the expertise of our eco shepherd, we were really able to move the goats off of areas before the milkweed was too heavily impacted, but almost everything else had been effectively grazed. So you can see them in the video eating in and around the milkweed, and it's one of the few plants left standing. We even observed the goats really delicately nibbling bindweed off of a common milkweed, but leaving it standing. So they really do have their own preference list, and they will eat very carefully according to it. Now, as a dovetail from that, though, I also did want to take a second to note dog strangling vine. So, as I know, that's a species of interest to many. Dog strangling vine is actually related to milkweed, and so it's also quite low on the goat's menu. So they absolutely will eat it, and if we left them long enough on the site, they would eat it. But then there would have possibly been greater impacts to the common milkweed. And it's that kind of consideration that can really benefit from an experienced shepherd. So that said, well, I wouldn't say that the goats had an obvious impact on DSV on our specific site in the short term. Again, we have to look at this longer term. That doesn't mean that they might not be effective in other sites where DSV is more prominent and not overshone by tastier plants, or that we have a bunch of common milkweed that we're trying to maintain in this area. So also early reports that the early observations that we have from TFN this year suggest that it was really heavily trampled post grazing, which could potentially reduce regeneration in future years of repeated grazing, although that will take some time to see. So TFN's ongoing monitoring and data as we move forward will really help us see how the meadow responds. But as I mentioned, we will need to kind of wait and see how the site responds over multiple years to really get a good measure of the invasive and native species population changes over time. But we can very much say that we had a great retention of some native species on site and heavily impacted the woody encroachment, which was really one of our largest concerns. So then what about the future? What about our next steps? So you are some of the very first to know the great news that we are bringing the goats back this year on June 10th and 11th. So given the initial success of the pilot in 2025, we'll be formally continuing this project and moving on to a rotational grazing model. So that essentially means that we'll be moving to the other ungrazed half of the meadow, and we'll essentially shift our grazing back and forth or around the park each year in a rotational way as decided by city staff and our eco shepherd. And also, any kind of data that's coming out of our monitoring with Toronto Field Naturalists. And we'll also be continuing that monitoring protocol with TFN and our photo monitoring so that we can really keep observing how the meadow responds over time. So lastly, as I've been working to bring the goats back again, I've been really continuing to try to spread the word about this project and really great opportunities like this one. So I'd really like to thank TFN and everyone who's come today for having me here. I hope it really helps communicate the City of Toronto's dedication to innovation and working at the forefront of natural environment management, and how much we've really valued working with TFN. Um, we really are excited and gratified to be the first to bring this to Ontario, and we'll be glad to inspire other land managers looking into grazing as a possible eco-friendly management option. Ever since last June, my email and phone is constantly ringing off the hook with people very interested in this project and how it can be adapted to various different land types and management goals. And that's been really interesting to see. So do make sure to check out the website, which has just gone live like 2 days ago. And if anyone has any questions, I'd really be happy to take them now. I do think that some of the best discussion comes during a Q&A, so I wanted to make sure to give that lots of time. But our website
So
is toronto.ca/grazing.
everything's in lecture now.
And so you can visit that site, and there's details on when they're coming and some of our background, and also when the public hours are for viewing the goats. I'm going to
Oh,
stop sharing, I think, for Q&A just so that I can actually see everybody, or maybe not see you, but see if your hand is up.
okay. Thank you, Cheryl. That was awesome.
No problem.
Okay, now anybody can post questions. I can start us off. So so why do you think the goats are particularly targeting the evasives? Like I know the goats are an invasive species, like they're not native to Ontario. Why do you think that that is?
Well, again, it's a little bit nuanced because they're not really targeting invasives. They're targeting whatever they like to eat, right? They're targeting their favorite food, and they've only ever grown up here, right? And so they've come in contact with all kinds of different plants, and um, they know what they like and what they don't like, and they know what their menu is, right? So they know what they're going to look for first. And so it's not so much that they are targeting invasives, it's that they're eating in their order of preference. And with the knowledge of their behavior and an experienced eco shepherd, then you can move them within and out of an area as they move down their order of preference. And also, if you were very specifically trying to target species that goats don't eat, then your project's not going to be successful. Or if you're only targeting a certain species, but within a very, very sensitive area, you also might have to be particularly careful. And that could include fencing off certain areas within a grazing area if you have really sensitive stuff in a spot, or there's a lot of process that goes into the decision of how to move the goats on and off the site. Because again, they're not picking and choosing; they just know what they want to eat, and they'll move through that menu.
Okay. I see one question in the chat. If they eat dog strangling vine, how do they deal with the roots, which I understand is how dog strangling vine spreads?
Yeah, so I mean, in our experience, we haven't really worked on dog strangling vine very much, right? So this is very new, right? This whole operation in this area has not been done before. And so a lot of invasive management or a lot of land management with grazers has been done for, well, a wide variety of invasive plants, but not as much dog strangling vines. So that's part of why we have this monitoring program, right? We're very curious to see how it responds over time. And the thing about goats that specifically I didn't mention before, very key for invasive species is that as seeds are taken in by a goat, as opposed to like a mower, is that the seeds are like rendered inactive in their digestive system. So when they poop out seeds, they aren't spreading the seed source. So over time, they're not only reducing biomass, but they're reducing a seed source. And their hooves are helping to disturb the soil, which helps with native generation and competition that way. And so the fact that they're reducing above ground biomass, they're reducing the ability for that plant to photosynthesize for periods of time throughout the growing season. And then they're also making the seed source reduce every single year as those seeds become inviable in their gut. That is sort of a goat specific benefit that something like mowing may not have or wouldn't have.
Okay. Do you anticipate this is a note from Michelle. Do you anticipate the same size herd for this year as last year?
I think this year it might be slightly smaller. We're looking closer to 50. Last year we had also anticipated 50, but more of the goats had babies than had been anticipated in the spring, and the herd was at such a size that it couldn't be split that year. And so we ended up just saying, just bring them all, bring everybody, more the merrier. But this year, I think we're going to have closer to 50. His herd is larger. The family groups will still be kept together, mothers with babies. Nobody's going to be separated that doesn't want to be. But I think we're going to have the herd a little closer to 50, but sometimes it will depend on how the herd splits.
Okay, thank you. A note from Christian. I think you've answered the first part of her question, but um, could you see other grazers like sheep being used in this project?
So in this project specifically, I don't know if sheep would be the best option. We did look into it. So sheep and goats eat different plants. They're similar, they're both grazing ungulates, but the sheep prefer grasses and goats prefer herbs. And so it does sometimes depend on what your management opportunities are and what your goals are. So, for example, sheep are a really great opportunity in something like a solar farm, which is predominantly grass and with solar equipment that a goat would invariably climb all over and destroy, which a sheep won't, right? And so there's small little nuance that way. It's not to say that sheep couldn't be used, and there could be a possibility in future years. Like I could imagine of having a mixed herd is also possible. Um, I believe there are some municipalities that are looking into that possibility. But for the time being, for the goals that we have, we're going to stick with the goats.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Anna. How do you consider the timing of the grazing going forward, in particular to ensure native plant species seed distribution is not negatively affected?
Yeah, so we are also trying this out. There are different impacts that can be undertaken from different times of year, and timing it's a little bit fluid, but it's also based on a few different things. So if you wait until later in the season, then you're really impacting biomass over the soil, but you may have missed a lot of seed opportunities. Um, and as well, the plants are less palatable to the goats later in the season. And so they might not graze in the same um, enthusiasm, we'll say. And so they may have to stay on the site longer, which is also an issue. And so right now we are sticking with the sort of early mid-June because it's late enough that things have come up, but it's not so late that we're past seeding and we're past palatability to the goats. And getting into as well. We also have to juggle some interesting logistical issues as well. Like the later in the season we go, the more likely we're getting into storm season. And this is the brickworks, and we're in a floodplain. And there's all kinds of things that are going into these choices. And so right now we're going to see how June affects over time. And we'll go from there.
Nice. What do the goats do in their off season when they're not working for the city?
Well, they only work for the city 2 days a year. So they are doing the other grazing projects. So wherever it is that Ian is contracted to, where Goats in the City is contracted to take the goats, and otherwise they live in and around King City. And so they live on a farm there. They graze and live there happily until they have a job, and then off they go to wherever that job may be. Um, there are a variety of people I know that have been speaking to me, so I expect that that herd is going to get even busier. But as I say, they're really not bothered by the work. They're getting to go to a brand new grazing area that's never been grazed before half the time, and that's very luscious and tasty to them. So, but yeah, they're only with us about 2 days a year.
Okay, thank you. How do you anticipate this being, do you anticipate this being an annual action and including more, I'll include Philip and Robert's question, including more areas in the city?
Yeah, so that's the million-dollar question, right? At the moment, this is looking like a yearly brickworks thing. We can say that. So we're moving to a rotational grazing model at the brickworks. Obviously, pending, uh, we could always find that it's having a detrimental effect. We don't believe so. It's having such a great effect already, but we're going to be monitoring it. And for the time being, this is a brickworks project with rotational grazing in mind, so different areas throughout the park each year. That said, it is obviously a replicable project. I think that there is great potential for other urban managed meadows within the city. I think there's also great potential for buckthorn understory. Could work quite well as well. Now, the challenge that we have that, say, a suburban or rural municipality does not have is that we can't just put goats everywhere and let them do their thing. In a highly urban area, right? We have to have 24-hour supervision. We have thousands of people showing up to see them. And while that outreach and engagement opportunity is core to our project, it also does kind of have to make us second guess a little bit on where it can be done and how it can be done safely. So all of these things are going to go into planning over the next few years. I would love to see it all over the place, but we have to we have to be careful and cautious and make sure that we're well planned.
Thank you. Question from Anna. Does the city have plans or preferences for the species composition of this meadow?
Do you mean an end stage? If you mean an end stage species composition, not specifically. At this stage, it's quite heavily non-native, non-compatible, invasive. There are certainly native species in there that we are trying to maintain. But for the first couple years, we wanted to focus just on grazing and seeing the impacts that that has. And then we may shift over to adding a seeding component or a planting component once we have a little bit of an idea how it behaves with just grazing. I think we don't want to muddy the waters too much by doing too much at the same time and then not really knowing what caused the benefit. And so I think the idea is that for the first few years, we will just graze, and then we'll start looking into preferred species assemblages, planting, seeding, seed balls, whatever it is that we move to.
Nice. I think one final question. Is it possible to graze near water, or is it only where we can have fences up?
Well, I think that depends on where the grazing is. If you're talking about Toronto, we have to have fences. There's just really no way that I would be able to navigate having a project with 65 goats and an open fence. Even with water, I think that there are ways to navigate working near water. I am very curious if they will eat Phragmites. I wonder if that's where that question was going. But I think that there are opportunities to test that in areas that aren't necessarily as complex as riparian areas as well. They're more sensitive to trampling and erosion. So I would be more curious to tackle some of the, you know, sort of interstitial spaces that have Phragmites that aren't maybe right in water before we get into those more complex areas. That said, outside of downtown Toronto, if you were managing an area with goats that had water, I'm sure that that would be something that they could manage. It's more of a question of the logistics of doing it in the middle of the city.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Cheryl. That was great. So certainly based on your description of goats, they certainly have a pretty nice life. 24-hour care, vets. Wow. Get to
Yeah,
do what they want. Wow, it's going to be nice to be a goat.
sounds like a great job, right? I'll
Yep,
take it.
exactly. All
Well,
right.
thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. That was terrific. Excellent.
Wonderful.
Bye, everyone.
All right, have a good afternoon.
See you, everybody.